Computer. Okay. Official. All right. Cool, y'all. I'm gonna start sharing and I'm going to share. Oh my gosh, there's so many things up on my computer. But so I'm gonna begin with last week's slides to just kind of run through this as a review. Um, so last week we talked about colonialism, right? I mean, we began with asking the question, what is peace? And folks came up with a bunch of different words, kind of trying to find peace sort of in the aggregate, right? Like peace is a bunch of things. You can't really just describe it with a synonym, but it's a number of things that coalesce to create conditions in which people can thrive, in which they experience justice, in which they have what they need, in which conflict, is absent, at least, significant, violent conflict. Peace is an aspirational something that we desire, that is difficult to secure, and one that we don't find too often in our world. So we talked about that a bit. And then we looked for a definition of colonialism. So we talked about colonialism being here, and let me move something out of the way real quick. Colonialism being an historical process by which one group asserts exploitative control over another, usually in the form of governmental, economic, military, cultural, and territorial domination. With settler colonialism being one manifestation of colonialism, just with the added function of settlers actually moving into the area and living there as members of the dominating group among the colonized. And then we spent just a second talking about imperialism as a similar concept that's slightly different. We didn't go too deep into this. We'll spend more time on this soon. But imperialism essentially, um, as the project of empire making through the domination and exploitation of economically and militarily subordinated territories. And so with the shorthand, this is really imprecise, but it gets us, I think, as far as we need to go for our purposes here, that imperialism is the engine and colonialism is the method. Um, and then we moved into some, historical examples, and we looked at this list of colonies from Wikipedia, the places that have been colonized, and it was just massive. I don't know what that was. Um, I think can can someone needs to mute. Someone has two devices on.
It's me.
Oh, okay. Can you mute one of those? Thank you, Dave. Um, yeah, and we're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, seeing that the world is something that has experienced colonization, not just a couple of places, not just a handful, but the world is something that has experienced the ravages and consequences of colonialism. Colonialism is a world system we discovered in essentially in many ways. We looked at the land and resources that were transferred through the process of colonialism, the trillions and trillions of dollars that were stolen from the colonized world, in the form of natural resources and land, in ways that are still true today. And as we move into capitalism, we will see the consequences of this process realized again today. We looked at the human cost of colonialism, the hundreds of millions that were killed. We talked about even the geologic consequences of colonialism and the way it transformed the atmosphere and migration patterns and feeding behaviors, all kinds of things. It transformed the world at a geological level. Um, and this was Eduardo Galeano talking about the process of colonialism and the exploitation of the colonized world. Walter Rodney talking specifically about Africa being underdeveloped while Europe was developed through the colonization of Africa. Um, Kimberly, your hands up.
Yeah, I saw the word alchemy in the last slide.
Hmm.
I was
Yeah.
curious what it said.
Yeah, so let's read that sentence. The empires and their native overseers in the colonial and neo-colonial alchemy, gold changes into scrap metal and food into poison. So what he's
Hmm.
getting at is, right, the wealth of the colonized world. There's a reason why white colonists went to these places, because they were rich in natural resources, and made sure that they controlled the area, right, through violence, and stole what made those countries, or they weren't countries at that point, but made those places, those territories. They stole the gold and returned to them scrap metal, right? The wealth of the colonized world was transformed by the colonizing power into their own poverty, right? So they weren't poor before, right? Like indigenous cultures had sustainable ways of living, but through the colonial encounter, they were robbed of their practices, of their land, of the resources on that land, and the colonial and neo-colonial alchemy of turning one thing into another, gold changes into scrap metal and food into poison.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then remember this clip. I think this was pretty affecting. There's this Rhodesian settler, who was talking to a servant of his, an African servant, right? And he calls him a stupid thing for not opening not opening the cokes that he was being served. And he talked about the violence, the that he was interested in, that he was worried about. He was worried about being displaced, from his place of privilege and power, by the anti-colonial sentiment that was growing in Rhodesia and across Africa and across the world, and was talking about the violent implications of that. We talked about Fanon, the total the totalizing project of colonialism, and not being just a mere economic process, but something that shapes the world itself, from the economic patterns to the thinking patterns of the people subjected to it and the people carrying it out. It's a whole life world, is one way of saying that. And he's saying that violence is the only way, in his mind, in the mind of many colonized people, the only way to overthrow the power of colonialism not being a thinking machine that can be appealed to in terms of a conscience it might hold, but it is sheer violence and can only be undone with greater violence. That's his thinking, and this influenced many decolonial movements. And these are just a handful. There are dozens more. But we just spent a little bit of time looking at these and some of the leaders, and the ways in which these leaders were assassinated, by colonial and imperialist forces, because they were trying to secure their own independence. And yeah, we spent some time thinking about peace in the face of colonialism, what the response ought to be, how nonviolence can be used, what tactics ought to be available to us, that sort of thing. So that's a review from for last time. Uh, any questions or anything folks want to raise from that? Okay. So we'll move into today, where we're going to be thinking about the violence of economic exploitation. And so we'll begin by looking at sort of what the terms are at the moment, and then try to understand how we got here, or how we live in a world in which economic violence is so common, so easy, so widespread. What has shaped the economic terrain of our world. So I'm going to begin with this video. Hopefully y'all can see this. Forward. So
Here's that ideal we have something about, something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart with this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top one.
So that's a really interesting video. Yeah, and worth spending more time on. But here, how do we go back? But you get the point, right? I mean, and that was 11 years ago. And the disparity has just gotten way worse since then. So in 2018, of course, and it's worsened since this, the 26 richest people in the world held as much wealth as half of the global population. 26 people, as much wealth as 3.8 billion people.
How much wealth is there?
I don't know. I don't know the total number. Let's see. Someone just send us the link for the video. Okay, we'll do. Yeah, I don't know what the total wealth is, just that the breakdown is profoundly disproportionate. And of course, poverty, right? Or this, this inequity globally creates poverty, creates hunger, homelessness, lack of education, overwork, sickness, premature death, right? It's not just about some people get to buy cool things and other people don't. It's about survival, right? It's about immiserating people while others, right, 1% own 40% of, the wealth of a single country. And then that, once you map it on, of course, to the colonized world, to the places that are still, battling the ravages of colonialism, the disparity intensifies. So what is capitalism? Capitalism is the political economy that dominates the world. It organizes geopolitics, it curates cultures, and structures the inequities that have prevailed since the primitive accumulations of colonialism. It's a thing that produces headlines like this. Jeff Bezos made over 7.9 million an hour every hour in 2023. And under 13 minutes, he brought in the equivalent of what the typical person earns in a lifetime. Right? It's insanity.
5 minutes.
Yeah, yeah. So
And
how
I
much?
had the nerve to buy a book from Amazon because I didn't think
Yeah, yeah.
this week.
Right. And so when we break that down, again, right, this is part of the consequence of colonialism. We break that down in terms of how wealth is distributed across race. We see that that there's profound disparities there as well, owing to racism, to the legacy of colonialism and slavery and apartheid in the US and elsewhere. Um, so, what is capitalism? Some folks have used the term racial capitalism. Um, it's an inescapable phenomenon or aspect of capitalism because it emerges alongside colonialism and the slave trade in the 16th century. The roots of it precede it, but precede this moment, but as it gets going, right, it flowers into the world system that it is alongside colonialism and the slave trade. So one way of defining this, and I think this is from the Oxford Dictionary, it's not a particularly critical definition, but a sort of a neutral one. An economic and political system in which property, business, and industry are controlled by private owners rather than by the state, with the purpose of making a profit. Right. So if you were to reduce capitalism to one essential theme, it's private ownership for profit, right? The ownership of the means of production, right? The things that produce the goods that people need or want, being controlled by private owners and used and disposed of for the purpose of making a profit. Why'd this go somewhere? Oh, it's taking us back to the dictionary. Um, so so there's this way of understanding how capitalism works. This is the labor theory of value, and this is really crude and really basic, right? Karl Marx writes 3 volumes of Das Kapital to try to lay all the specifics of capitalism out scientifically. But this is an extremely reduced model. So if the materials to make a chair, say, cost $20, the wood and the tools to put it together, the raw materials, along with the tools and whatever, are transformed by the labor of the worker into a commodity that can be bought and sold. And so say, for argument's purpose, say the commodity is sold for $80. How much was made in profit? Well, we can't answer that question with the information provided. We need to know what the how much the labor was compensated for to understand how much profit was made. So we get this equation at the bottom, because profit exists as the difference between the cost of the materials and the amount the worker is compensated for their labor. So if it's sold for 80 and the materials cost 20, then whatever Y is determined by how much the worker is paid in wages. So the profit that the capitalist can secure is determined by whatever the wages of the worker, whatever those wages are. So the worker transforms $20 of raw materials into an $80 commodity. And so in doing so, the worker creates $60 of value. But what will the worker be compensated of? Certainly not the full value, right? Or the capitalist wouldn't turn a profit. The worker will be compensated from between $0 to $39, but never the full value of their labor, or the capitalist has no reason to be in business, right? So the capitalist's drive, the capitalist's goal is to suppress that number to as close to $0 as possible in order to turn a better profit for themselves and the firm's shareholders. Dave, your hand is raised.
Yeah, what about you're forgetting the overhead of the organization?
Of
There's
course. Of course, this is extremely simple. One way of getting to that might be to say that, say the $20 is included in the raw materials, right? Whatever it takes to the basic factors, the basic elements it takes to make the commodity are then turned into something sellable by the worker. who transforms. And of course, this is a different era, right? We're not all just like showing up to work at a factory to make commodities to sell. But this is a really basic way of understanding the position of the worker in relation to the capitalist. So, and and there's plenty of things that the equation is missing, right? So does the capitalist contribute to the production of value? On the equation, it seems to suggest that maybe they don't, that it's just the worker who takes the raw materials and turns it into something sellable, and that the capitalist doesn't offer anything useful. But I don't think that's true. I don't think most people would think that that's true. There are certain circumstances, perhaps, in which the capitalist is someone who just has the money, right? Who can just back, a proposal or just finance a firm, and all they have to offer is the money. And that's one of the things that Marx has in mind when he's critiquing this. But one can also imagine a lot of situations in which the capitalist is contributing something, is arranging the process in which raw materials can be turned into a commodity and sold, and orchestrates the logistics of that, and hones the process, or develops advertising, a whole host of things that the capitalist does offer. I'll continue that point, but I see that Chi Ling or Ping has their hand raised.
Yeah, and I understand. I mean, these are such complex concepts, and people spend years in courses talking about this sort of stuff. So I understand it has to be simplified for discussion to occur. And I think most reasonable people should question and be appalled by the differential, the drastic differential that is presented by some of these statistics. But what gets simplified, when you talk about capital versus labor is, and I forgot who spoke, was it Dave or somebody, William, he mentioned just one thing, but it's a bunch of things, I think, when you talk about the other side, other than the laborers, which is, concepts, innovations, coming up with things, incentivizing, the overhead that William talked about, which is not just paying the rent, but there's also the risk because of the chairs. You can make chairs, but people don't buy them. Who bears the risk? It's kind of a bond versus a stock. It's like the bondholders will always get paid first. So the labor, and it's true, some of them get screwed and don't get paid, but generally most employees are going to get paid. But let's look at the restaurant business as an example. Like half the restaurants fail because someone invests money, they do stuff, and they'll pay their employees. But after a year or two, it doesn't happen because actually margins are really low in restaurants. There's like this romantic notion, I'm going to open a restaurant, you're going to feed people, they're going to be happy, they're going to love me. And they realize, well, it's not that easy. And, it's the person coming up with the idea and backing it with their own money that takes that risk. So, all to say that there's all these different elements that go on to both sides. So that was my point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Steve, your hand is raised.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying about that. If you ever watch Shark Tank,
Yeah.
you ever watch that? It just makes me furious. But one of the things that the sharks, the people who are being solicited to invest in these productions, these projects, they present the great value in having them be the supporters, not just the money they put in, but also their expertise in marketing and their familiarity with the kind of commodity this is, whether it's a food product or a clothing product or something. They have some already connections and expertise in that. The thing that is a problem for me is it's hard to judge that from outside. I have no idea how good they are. Now, apparently the people who are asking them for money have looked into this and they understand what sort of contribution these people can make. But it's hard to boil this down and put it into a formula of any kind that gives us any good meaty stuff to work with. Do you think?
Mm.
See what I mean?
So, yeah, absolutely. Certainly, there are so many intangibles, and when talking about what value is, difficult to to put labels, to put numbers on the value of of a competency or creative capacity or some of the things that many capitalists claim for themselves. Um, if we went into the number of ultra wealthy, right? I mean, in that one statistic, the 26 people who own as much wealth as 3.8 billion people, right? Can one say that the creative capacity of 26 people, right, is so outstrips the labor power of 3.8 billion people that they deserve to own as much wealth as them, right? Precisely because those people don't have anything, because the drive of capitalism is to drive down their wages and to increase profits, and the people who experience that that windfall are the capitalists, who are presumably these geniuses who have such such a talent for business, and for some reason they all end up being cishet white men, in the US and Europe, many of whom, right, their parents were already wealthy, right? There's like so many things that you say, how much does this really have to do with the value that you are creating for the world? And how much is this system which grinds down workers and takes the value that they create and gives it to the capitalist? So one way of, so to what degree is the capitalist contributing, and, how necessary are things like the wealthy shareholders to the production process itself? There are so many people who are parasitic upon the system and who are making money, but even less than the sharks who are there because they supposedly have some level of competency in business, just already had money, and so they could invest in something and receive stocks back, and other people are generating the wealth that they are enjoying. One way of getting to the core of it is asking this really moral question of who has the power to create the conditions that determine how much value is returned to the worker. Who controls the means of production and the flow of profit? So is it these people, right, who we've seen through colonialism? There's this language of primitive accumulation. That's a Marxist term. That those people who, you can, like Ping was raising, there are folks, who scrape things together and take out a risky loan to start a business that is a serious risk. And those people certainly exist, but those people don't dominate the world economy, right? Those people don't drive war. Those are the people who aren't scraping, the bottom of the earth for oil, who are poisoning the oceans, right? We live in a world that is structured by oligarchy and by corporate globalized capitalism. And those people, right, those boards, those CEOs, those capitalists get to decide how much value is returned to the worker. They get to control the means of production, how we create commodities, which commodities we create, and how it's done. And they control the flow of the profit. And that is backed by the state itself, as we see so often, the state acting in accordance with the interests of capital rather than the people themselves. And so one thing that Marx talks about is the dictatorship of capital being realized in the state. That in many ways what we are observing is the capitalist class being protected and sustained by the machinations of the state. So Steve, your hand was just up, and then you took
It
it back
was.
down.
I'm getting, my mind is kind of going in circles now. The problem is the asymmetrical nature of this. These 28 people. opposed to the 3.8 billion the rest of us. You know, who is to control that? Who is to say that their contribution is worth more? Well, they are, because they control, they write the checks.
Yeah.
And where do the rest of us come in, and how can this asymmetrical system be overcome without actually turning into a different kind of tyranny, which is sort of what happened with Russia. You know, they came at it with a good idea, and then they became the person that they opposed. They became the oppressor in order to overcome oppression. And it's an easy trap to fall into. It seems like practically every organization does that, no matter how altruistic their initial motives. Very rapidly, their primary concern and primary priority is the survival and prosperity of the organization, or the institution, or the religion, or the party, or whatever it is that they're contributing to the structure of. It's a hard thing to not happen. It's a hard thing to overcome without becoming the villain. And that's why I put my hand back down, because I don't have a good answer to this, and I'm hoping somebody does.
No, that you're taking us in exactly the right direction. Here, let me look. We got a couple.
And just
Hey, I got,
Yeah, Ping.
yeah, I was just gonna say, I agree with what you both said. I mean, it's easy to talk about at academic level and kind of rant, for lack of a better term, about the injustices in the world, but you bring it down to like everyday folks. Like, let's look at the people in this room or whatever, or my parents, or the Cubans, or why are the Cubans voting for Trump, or why are people leaving their countries and wanting to come to the United States? Why did my parents leave everything that they had in China, or friends we know left everything in other countries to come to a country where they feel they would have opportunities that were not centrally controlled by the state, and having the rationale of everyone according to their will be provided according to their needs. And Stephen alluding to Russia having a more whatever, I don't even know what they call their system now, whether it leans more communist, Marxist, or whatever, where everyone's supposed to be equal. But what that means is the people in power just take this, Putin, supposedly, no one can prove it, but most people believe he is actually the wealthiest person in the world by far, because he's stolen all the riches of the country and have squirreled it away under all these machinations. But I digress. But it's easy to rant about, I think, the faults and the weaknesses and the weakness of unions, and we can talk about all that. But it's like, what is the alternative? It's easy to talk about in concept, we should have more equality, but are we talking about equality in result or equality in opportunity? I know people say that all the time, but it's just a very, I think, hard, complicated thing, which is what Stephen is.
could I just say, one way to redress this imbalance, in part, is to tax. And the rate of taxation on the wealthy has plummeted. Tax capital gains, tax income. That's a way to redistribute wealth without, if you don't want to overturn the system and change private ownership.
I agree.
That's one way. But it would take a huge movement. You can imagine what kind of a movement would it take to kind of shift that huge imbalance and make it more fair. I don't see it around right now.
Yeah, Dave raised his hand, and then Steve.
The biggest problem, I think, is that we've allowed our government, our politicians that are in the government to be bought by corporations. We've United, whatever that law was, something United.
Citizens United.
Citizens United, where corporations can invest money. They basically buy the politicians. The politicians make so much money from them that they may pass laws to support lower taxes, and that's what happened. I think that's the biggest problem, that the interaction between the state and the corporation.
Yeah. So Steve and then Emily.
I agree absolutely with what you're saying, Dave, and also with you, Bill. That taxation is the probably the best way of moderating that imbalance, and it was in pretty good shape until the really high rollers got in charge of being able to decide who gets elected to office and who gets elected to the offices that control how much they get taxed. And so they are just, they're just squealing like a stuck pig if you try and take away 1% of their income, but that's where the difficulty lies, as I see it, is that there's no way of getting the government to play along with this idea that it's not fair. It is just simply not fair to have this kind of power invest in the plutocracy, the governance by the obscenely wealthy. That is a tough sell, to try and get the voters, who are not impressing me very much with their wisdom right now, to elect people who will bring some kind of sensible policies into play concerning the taxation and the distribution of our wealth. That's all I got.
Yeah, thank you. So Emily, and then Nate.
Yeah, just some examples of taxation. Look at Scandinavia, Sweden and Norway. Even my kids in France, with basically free college, basically free medical care, daycare, a lot of government services that are paid for by a very high rate of taxing, but they're happy because they get something for it. So that's been, we can see that already functioning. We just choose not to.
Yeah.
Whether we agree with that or not, Emily, that will never happen in this country, because they pay 55% of their income in taxes. So imagine having that debate in this country.
Yeah, well, we used to pay 70% here. So if you look at it historically,
under Eisenhower, we did. The Republican.
In my lifetime, we've gone from 70% to 18% for capital gains. So that's happened over the course of our lifetime, basically because the Civil Rights Act got passed. And once Black people were allowed to be, considered complete part of the United States and full participation was given to them, the privatization movement and privatizing everything that was public led to Ronald Reagan being elected, led to the Reagan tax cuts, led to the Bush tax cuts, led to the Trump tax cuts, and that has enabled the growth in wealth and deregulation, the growth in wealth that leads to that video that Connor just showed us. If you look at the history of the United States, in terms of capitalism, FDR saved capitalism. Capitalism was unregulated until 1932. And we had the crash of 29. Because capitalism naturally has boom and bust periods. That's what capitalism does unless it's regulated. And it still does it even when it is regulated. So we had the crash of 29. Roosevelt saves, the rest of the world is either going communist or fascist. And we saved our so-called republic by Roosevelt regulating capitalism massively for the first time. And we've been doing it ever since, creating Social Security, creating everything else. We had 50 years of regulated capitalism. And once the Civil Rights Act got passed, the privatizers won, and they've been deregulating it, enabling the wealthy to concentrate the wealth
Wow.
much more. And that's where the racial element of capitalism in this country kind of plays out. I would argue for two things right now. I think we should have been arguing for a 30-hour or a 20-hour work week and a guaranteed minimum wage for everyone in the world, especially in this country, because if we distribute the wealth and tax the people the way we should be taxing the people, we should have a guaranteed minimum income. Second, we should have a 30-hour work week. Third, we should have a wealth tax, and it should be 2% a year at least, because the billionaires can afford it because they're making a lot more than that just on their capital gains of watching the market. So, you know, there's a lot of things we could be doing collectively to be pushing for a redistribution of this wealth. We could go to a new system that has never been created. I would argue that the Soviet Union was never what they called themselves communist. It was actually state capitalism. I think that the Chinese are state capitalists. I think none of the so-called socialist countries have ever been socialist because the world order is still maintained by capitalists. Therefore, the socialists have never really been allowed to be socialist. They've kind of had the state run it as if it were a private entity, and they don't know how to do it. They're terrible at it. And that's unfortunately the way Cuba is run, you know, in a great extent. They provided a lot better, you know, like distribution of wealth, but you're still trying to run everything from the state-centered mentality, but you're running it in a world capitalist system, and it's impossible to do that. So the long term would be a world socialism. I don't know if we'll, you know, it won't be happening in my lifetime, but the short term needs to be a redistribution of wealth through taxation, through a guaranteed minimum wage.
Wow.
Thanks.
All right.
I wanna make sure folks here in person get a chance to respond too. I saw some like reactions. I felt some
Yeah.
reactions in the room. Anybody have thoughts? I saw you react, Sarah.
Yeah. I was sort of questioning whether really, you know, what I think of when I see that video is the game of Monopoly. And you play Monopoly and it starts out, everyone's even, everyone has the same amount. And then at a certain point of the game, something tips. And you know someone's going to win and everyone else is going to go broke. And I think that, I mean, Monopoly was created to teach people about capitalism. And I think that is the inevitable way that capitalism goes. It's capitalism rewards greed. Capitalism is powered by greed. Adam Smith said, I'd rather depend on the greed of the butcher to feed my family than his generosity. Which works in the early days of Monopoly. And then it shifts and everything, and there's a gravity towards, basically it ends up being the one person. And I think that's where we're seeing society go. The gravity is to that one person. I think that Citizens United isn't the cause of it. I think Citizens United is the effect that happened because of that. And unless you start the game over with everyone having, what is it, $1,500 and getting 200 every time they pass go, the gravity just keeps more and more towards that.
Yeah, good points. Nate, your hand is up again.
No, sorry, that's from before. Sorry, I didn't take it down.
Oh, okay. No worries. All right, I'm just going to read the chat real quick too. Nate said something earlier. He said, as you point out, Connor, capitalism's overall natural tendency is to drive down the living wage and to look for the lowest wages around the world. This will happen unless workers organize to resist that and demand collectively to be paid more of what value they've added. Also, capitalism orders society by putting people to work en masse. Unemployment threatens the ordering of society. In terms of disruption, now we're entering an AI information age that threatens capitalism's order because we will not need to be working 40 or even 30 hours a week. Therefore, one thing that we as workers should be collectively organizing for is a guaranteed minimum wage for everyone, redistribution of wealth. Another thing, okay, and you gave us that recommendation too. Great points. Kimberly, remember there was a time where the capitalists were not questioned, I suppose, as much as they are today. Thank goodness there's a lot of truth being spoken. The shedding of blood, like Fanon says, is what's required. I haven't played these games since childhood, teenage years. I need to play these games again. I've forgotten a lot. Yeah, it's a really good primer. And yeah, and the I don't know, the cruelty of capitalism. So yeah, so I mean these things have been raised, these topics, these have been the historic answers to some of these problems. Socialism, right, as a different kind of political economy in which the means of production, distribution, and exchange are owned or regulated by the community as a whole. And you know, to Nate's point, right? Community, I mean that sounds kind of nice if that's just us, sort of like what Ping was saying, if it's just people. But it's a state that's doing it, right? In most of the examples that we know of. And so a state controls the means of production, distribution, and exchange. And so one of the things, you know, Mark's talked about, right? So it's I think someone was drawing an analogy. It might have been Ping. I don't want to put words into your mouth. Forgive me if I've done so, but of saying like, well, yeah, within capitalism, it's, you know, kind of a private person or, you know, people in general, that a sort of class of people who do this. And under socialism, it's just that the state does it, and that the state is, you know, has its own interests and, you know, wants to protect itself, and these things that are really reasonable to think are true. And may certainly be what's been borne out historically. But the ideal, you know, or the philosophy that's driving it is the sense that while under capitalism, the state is the dictatorship of the capitalist class. Under socialism or communism, the state is the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so that's supposed to be, you know, kind of tongue-in-cheek oxymoron, right? Because what's the dictatorship of the workers, you know, of all the people? Well, it's not really a dictatorship, right? It just means that the people get to decide and not this much smaller capitalist class. The 3.8 billion get to have a say rather than the 26 people, right, working the levers of the state. So that's folded within communism as the larger philosophy that drives the system of socialism. Communism is committed to the ideal that workers should own the means of production, right? Not just capitalists, not the people who had the wealth to begin the firm, you know, to start it, but the people who actually produce the value, who do the work, that they should all collectively and democratically run it, that they're entitled to all that they produce, and that everyone should be provided for according to their need. Communism as a philosophy sees socialism as a developmental stage, which will result in the withering away of the state, so that eventually, you know, once the state sufficiently dismantles, you know, the capitalist, you know, culture and production processes, that it will cease to need to exist. But of course, that requires actual democratic control of the state, which is not certainly always been the case. So some of these 20th century liberation movements, you know, have ascribed to some form of communist philosophy in the Marxist tradition. Some of them have been named in our conversation. There are many, many more than are listed here. And in many cases, right, in all of these, they've been to some degree, to different degrees, characterized by a significant redistribution of wealth and huge decreases in poverty, increased accessibility of housing, food, and medical care, and a different kind of political determination. And of course, in each of these contexts, you know, we could spend years analyzing each of them and the significance of you know, of this turn in those contexts. But I should just note that in some of these instances, excesses should be noted. Analyses of these historical projects can't be divorced from the conditions that preceded the movement, or the antagonisms from the capitalist imperialist world that followed, you know, or continued, you know, as threats from within. Chiling or Ping, your hands raised.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to ask, and I don't know the statistics. I'm not an expert or a student of this, but from what I've read from popular literature and various publications. I mean, I think the standard of living, meaning when they measure, and this is the UN and other people, like, well, what do people in these countries, the ones in the list here, what do they actually have to live on? And it's not just slightly lower. I mean, it's significantly lower, maybe 10%, you know, whatever it is, of the standard of living, whether it's the US, other industrialized nations. I mean, you could say, well, that maybe that all goes back to colonialism, but I don't think it's that simple. I mean, I think you have to ask, well, why is it that a state that espouses a certain, you know, political and economic philosophy ends up in a situation where their citizens are poor and starving, and much more so than in other political and economic systems?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so one of the things to take note of is like I said in this little italicized note is understanding the conditions that preceded the moment, right? So to say, you know, China, right, the Great Leap Forward brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, you know, and out of a feudal serfdom, and by any reasonable standard, increased the standard of living of the people who were, you know, who got to enjoy the benefits of that revolution. Same in Russia, right, under the Tsars. Same in Cuba, right, under their colonial, right, slave masters, and then neo-colonial imperialist overseers throughout Africa, right. And so many of these movements, there's a movement forward, but then there is also there's a sort of ceiling. When one realizes in each of these contexts that they're also isolated from global trade by you know, by capitalist countries that control global markets, that impose tariffs and blockades and militarily intervene, and so there are a number of ways in which each of these experiments or attempts ought to be you know, ought to be contextualized within that, you know, alongside all those factors. And then also to see again that, well, anyways, some folks are raising their hands. Steve, and I think just Steve, and then your hand is still raised.
Yeah, the idea of communism being a transitory state in the process of eliminating capitalism, I find that hard to buy. The idea that the people should enjoy the benefit, the profits of the fruits of their own vineyards and stuff like that is all really good, but it does not take into account the human competitiveness and the human desire to be superior to others, to be more powerful, at least not to be vulnerable. That is the kindest way to say it, that people desire not to be vulnerable to other people. And so in order to prevent that, they sort of aspire to power. And it's hard to overcome that because that's real human. We all feel it. We all are experience that. And I think that going back to what Nate was talking about was the idea of getting, and also Bill, the idea of getting laws made, getting a government made by the hand of the voters that will pass the laws that will do what we need done, rather than just relying on human kindness and brotherly love, because you see where that got us. You know, where there are no enforceable boundaries on behavior, somebody who is a little power mad was perfectly happy to just trample over them and just disregard what is thought to be good form and good manners and good citizenship and decency. If it's not a law, who cares? I'm winning. And it's that's the sort of thing that's very, very difficult to overcome. And I think where Nate was coming from of getting legislation in place that will allow that to happen. And in order to have that, you got to have the legislators, and in order to have that, you got to convince the voters, which is a tough call, and the hour is late.
Yeah, totally. I mean, those are good points. And I think one of the responses might be, you know, I mean, that appeal to kind of to human nature is fraught, right? I mean, people have the sense that the human is a particular kind of thing. The Marxist would push back and say the human is conditioned by their circumstances, right? The human is constructed by the mere material conditions in which they live. The human is, you know, the racist fascist of Germany and whatever the opposite of that is, you know, anywhere else. Like the human is all kinds of things. And so that particular construction of the human is something that has arisen alongside of colonialism and capitalism. And there's a, you know, a whole Western philosophy of humanism and enlightenment movement to suggest that the human is a particular kind of thing. And then the secondary movement is to say that human as constructed is best served by a system that incentivizes greed. That may not be the move either, right? To say that, well, we're also selfish, so what? We give ourselves away to a system that is you know, functions according to power, according to who is able to secure power earlier and more decisively, or is it one in which people are as best as can be approximated, rendered equal, you know, economically, so that that power can't be wielded over anyone else because no one can secure that kind of ascendancy over others. So it may be that socialism or communism actually ministers to the human or to that greedy tendency better than capitalism, which seems to stoke it or take advantage of it or use it as fodder for these great inequalities and you know, and violences. Emily said Cuba is a poor country, but their people have a longer lifespan than the US. It's true. Kimberly, my cousin, traveled to Cuba before I did. After I traveled there, he asked me, what do you have to say about Cuba, about the people? I said, the country is so needy, yet so self-sufficient. Yes. And of course, under the duress of neocolonial and imperialist intervention. Nate, lots of people, including me, would argue that China and the Soviet Union were and are state capitalist. Yes, there certainly are people who argue that. Yeah, and Emily's hand is raised.
I'm remembering a comment one time a Cuban pastor told me, and he said, the problem with the socialism is that it doesn't account for sin.
Yep. Yep, absolutely right.
You know, it expects people to be what the Bible wants them to be, and we don't always go there.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, capitalism rewards sin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's good.
Yeah. Dave, we certainly don't want to exchange our form of government, capitalism, with socialism, communism. We need to tax people fairly, and that generates funds for governments to provide services to poorer class. FDR at one time had highest tax at 93%. Corporations have many tax loopholes that enable them to avoid tax. There needs to be a minimum tax on corporations. Qiling or Ping, not to belabor it here, but it seems from a lot of sources that the Great Leap Forward in China was a dismal failure. Famine, millions dead, and continued poverty. Yeah, that's something we could certainly continue to debate. So economic peace. We're sort of, you know, we're sort of getting around some of these questions. Which system is more likely to encourage aggression, incite war, and drive ecological degradation? Which system has a better chance of leading to peace, of securing safety, well-being, and dignity for all people? Which system gives workers more power over their own lives and the fruits of their labor, leading to real democracy? Which has the potential to reduce the need for labor and create more opportunity for widespread leisure and creativity? So these are questions which I hope just push us forward, right, on this question. there's certainly, I don't know that any of us have agreed on anything beyond the inequality is stark, that the violence that it represents needs to be addressed. And so how we move forward likely doesn't have a discrete and particular precedent. It's likely something we have to develop, and we have to learn lessons from the successes and failures of of each of these systems, and try to develop something that can answer these questions and say that it is better on all these levels than anything that has been offered before. And so I think I have some proposals. How do we get there? Right. I think we we should build the consciousness and analysis of the general population and of the worker as such, as a worker, as someone who is aware and conscious of their status as worker in relation to a capitalist class, to understand the power that they have. Which would help them to do number two, to build strong unions that organize labor and develop the power of workers to withhold their labor if they need to, as a means of securing demands that weaken the capitalists' dominating and exploitative power. It's also useful, I think, to interrupt the flow of capital, making it less lucrative and harder to maintain, to become ungovernable by capitalist oligarchs and demand more equitable and democratic distribution of wealth. And four, to build alternative communal economies that refuse to participate in global capitalism, gift economies, exchange and trade on a local and communal level, right? To just take care of each other in community. One of the things that we often run into, right, is simply the threat of the state itself, as a formation that is invested in its own perdurance. And that maybe part of the problem is trying to do this on this global scale, or even a national scale that is massive, right? So how do we develop a system that that equally distributes wealth, wealth that's produced, and that doesn't become carceral, right, or authoritarian and in a destructive way? Maybe we need to start thinking about organizing ourselves not in terms of nations or states, but in terms of communities that care for one another, and exchange the things that we have, and take care of each other. So these are just some ideas. Maybe we can agree on some of them, maybe not. But there's something in the chat. Nate, I am really enjoying this discussion and hearing various points of view in our church. Thank you, Ping, Dave, Kim, Emily, Sarah, Stephen, and Connor, for all your contributions. Yeah, absolutely. And Kimberly has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just want to, reemphasize that definitely the pandemic mobilized people to do many of the things that you mentioned, Connor. I live in Prospect Heights, and man, do we have a thriving buy nothing.
Yeah.
The swapping, even in Crown Heights, their version, it's just, people are really engaged, and you can ask for, people will ask for food. It's like, I don't have any food, and people will just, they will come and offer their food. So that's, these kind of measures definitely really kind of, I'm sure they happened previously in some point, but I'm just a baby of the 60s, mid 60s. So it definitely kicked this kind of, community and care more in gear.
Yeah, those are the kinds of things we should try to empower, try to practice ourselves and invest in. So yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for all the perspectives represented here tonight, and the desire that is clear in all of us to create economic peace, to make sure that people have what they need, people aren't exploited, that people aren't hungry or homeless. And so let's continue as we exist in community together to think think through our obligations to create that world. I'm excited to continue to do that with you all. So thank you for being here tonight, and have a good night, y'all. I'll
Thank
be
you,
seeing
Connor. This has been
Thank,
great.
thank you.
everyone.
Good to see
Yeah.
you.
You see too. Good night.
Peace.
Night.
Peace.